The screams were never written down. What they recorded was cleaner: that he died in Berkeley Castle, that he died in the night, that no one saw the body. But bodies leave traces, and what they did to his was not silence. It was orchestration. They say the bed was stuffed with thick cloth, so no one could hear, that the iron was red when they brought it in, glowing like the eye of an old god. There would be no blade, no blood, just fire pressed inside, so deep it would never be spoken of again. They say he screamed through his teeth, unable to move. They say the guards looked away, but they never wrote it. Not the bishop, not the son who became king, not the lords who wanted him forgotten. They burned the truth into flesh, then buried the flesh in rumor. A servant went mad. A horse refused to enter the chamber. For 3 nights after, the castle stank of oil and skin. The records call it natural causes, but the red-hot iron never lies. It was not death. It was theater, and history still pretends it never watched. Edward was not a warrior, not the kind the crown demanded. He loved music. He built canals. He watched the way water bent around stone and spoke more to masons than to knights. In a court of war-hardened men, he wore silks that whispered when he walked. He chose favorites not for battle, but for affection. That was his first sin. The second was surviving it. When his lover, Piers Gaveston, was executed by nobles, Edward wept, not as a king, but as a boy. That weakness stained him, not with blood, with memory. The barons saw it. The Queen saw it. England does not forgive a king who loves wrong. When Isabella rode back from France with an army and a new man beside her, the message was clear: Edward would not die a king. She kissed her son's forehead and raised a sword. The boy was 13, old enough to watch. Edward fled not like a coward, but like a man trying to live in a story that had already been written. He was caught, dragged from abbey to dungeon, stripped of crown and comfort. They called him Sir Edward, no longer majesty, just another prisoner in the cold stone belly of England. In Berkeley Castle, they gave him just enough food to stay alive, just enough hope to stretch the dread. The walls were damp with mold, the bed filled with lice. His guards changed daily, not to protect him, but to erase any human bond. He was unmade slowly. First the title, then the power, then the body. He did not scream at first, but when the red iron came, the castle stopped breathing, and no one wrote what came next, because they wanted it to happen again, just not to them. There was no single betrayal. It came in a sequence, like a slow dirge played in reverse. Edward's fall was not the result of one mistake, but of a kingdom quietly deciding to forget him while he was still alive. It began with whispers in Parliament, papered over with formality and oaths of allegiance. His enemies were not foreign. Not nameless they were: his barons, his wife. His friends turned shadows. They told him nothing directly. They never had to. The meals grew colder, the rooms more silent. Letters stopped arriving. Then came the parchment that stripped him of the throne, not in front of a crowd, not with a sword, but behind closed doors, with signatures and ink and finality. They said he abdicated. They said he agreed. But no one who watched his hands shake as he signed believed it was choice. The moment he laid down the pen, the world stopped calling him king. The humiliation did not end there. His captors made it so. On the road to his imprisonment, they dressed him in rough cloth, let the villagers spit. A king who could not command respect was no longer a king at all. His name was used less and less. Guards referred to him only as the prisoner. They passed messages about him as if he were already dead. They moved him from one cold cell to another, never letting him settle, never letting him know which stone floor would be his last. At night, he would try to remember the sounds of his court, the harp in the west chamber, the slow laughter of Gaveston echoing through marble halls, but memory was not strong enough to light the walls. Cold replaced everything. Even the tears refused to fall, frozen into stillness just behind his eyes. Berkeley Castle was the last stop. No longer a fortress. It became his mausoleum in waiting. The guards were rotated constantly, a cruel tactic to prevent familiarity. He was to be forgotten, even by his jailers. And yet, even in confinement, Edward was still dangerous. He had not died. He had not confessed. And somewhere in the kingdom, there were those who still called him king. This was the problem. He lived, and so the myth of his legitimacy lived with him. They needed not just silence, they needed obliteration. A death that couldn't be made into a martyrdom, a death no one would dare to sing about. So they devised something worse than execution desecration disguised as accident. No gallows, no blade, no grave. They sent for a tool, not a man. His name is lost, but his silence was paid for. The executioner would not be robed or revealed. He would not be seen again after the deed. He arrived with a leather sack and did not speak. The room was prepared, not a cell, but a chamber padded with straw and cloth. Not for comfort, for secrecy. No sound must escape. The walls of the castle must remain clean. The screams must never be recorded. This was not just punishment. It was a ritual designed to erase a body without spilling a drop. Edward was fed a warm meal that night. Roast meat, heavy wine, salted bread. It was not mercy. It was mockery. They wanted his blood to flow faster, his pain to rise more quickly. When the door opened, it was not with violence. It was quiet, calculated. 4 men entered, faces covered. One held him down. One pulled away his robes. Another clutched his wrists. The 4th held the iron, red, hissing, pulled from a brazier that glowed in the corner like a second sun. Edward fought. Of course he did. But the meal had been drugged, and his limbs betrayed him. He could not scream properly, only shallow gasps, muffled by the cloth stuffed into his mouth. The iron was inserted with precision, not rage. The goal was to burn from within no visible wound, no martyr's mark. They believed this would hide the truth. But the truth has a smell. It filled the room. Flesh turned black in seconds. The hiss of fire inside flesh is not one history dares write. But those walls remember it. The men did not speak, not even when Edward convulsed, not even when he bit through his tongue trying to cry. When it was done, they left the room sealed. No priest, no bell, no final words. In the morning, they claimed he died in the night. Natural causes, no signs of struggle, no marks of murder. His body was not put on display. It was rushed into the ground before questions could bloom. The chronicles call it peaceful. But what kind of peace smells like fat cooked over iron? This was not just a killing. It was a message to all who might resist the crown, to all who might love the wrong person, to all who dared wear silk instead of steel. Edward's death was not punishment for treason. It was punishment for being a king who refused to be cruel enough, a king who held hands instead of swords, a king who looked at men the way queens were expected to look, and that was unforgivable. After his death, there were no rebellions, only silence, a kind of fear that seeps into the soil. The castle was not scrubbed clean, only locked. Servants whispered that animals avoided the tower. One swore the birds stopped singing above it. A nun who had once blessed his marriage later confessed to hearing screaming in her sleep, though she had never visited the site. They say his ghost wandered the halls, not to haunt, but to ask a question no one wanted to answer. Did anyone mourn him? Isabella never admitted what she knew. She wept at the funeral, a gesture for the court. Her son, now King Edward III, remained silent. He never spoke of his father again, not in public, not even in private letters. But silence is its own confession, and England moved on. as if moving on could hide what had happened. The red-hot iron was never found. The room was sealed. The bed was burned. But the story persisted, never officially written, yet whispered in corners and passed through servants' mouths like forbidden prayers. Some say a guard went mad after the deed. Others claim the man who held the iron later cut out his own tongue. The truth is uncertain, but the pattern is not. The past does not vanish. It ferments, and when it rises, it does not come with answers, only rot. Edward's fall was not just a political shift. It was an exorcism. England removed not a man, but a spirit it could not understand, a softness mistaken for weakness, a complexity mistaken for sin. He was not a tyrant. He was something worse to those in power, unpredictable. And in the theater of monarchy, unpredictability is a crime worth fire. There is no statue for him, no poem, no monument where children lay flowers. Only a line in a chronicle, a date, a lie. But the room still stands, and it remembers what was done. They say it happened in silence, but silence is never silent in a place like Berkeley. The stone absorbs everything. The cries, the last breath, the hiss of something ancient being summoned. That night, no servant lit a torch. No horse neighed. Even the wind slowed as if dreading what would come. The castle was not awake, but alert, like a body holding its breath. This was not just a death. It was a rite, rehearsed, calculated, intimate. The men sent to perform it were not butchers. They were functionaries, selected not for cruelty, but for loyalty, and for the absence of conscience. They were told nothing. Only what to do, only when to leave, only that it must look like nothing had happened. No blood, no wound, no scream too loud to be denied. The fire was prepared behind thick walls. The brazier had burned for hours, stoked in secrecy, not too hot to kill immediately, just enough to burn slowly. Red, orange, white. Edward had not spoken in 2 days. His food had come bland. His eyes were half shut. They thought he had broken, that he was already a shell. But when they entered the room, the king, if still a king, stood, thin, filthy. But standing, he asked one question. No one answered. One of the guards flinched, but the others moved fast. They pinned him down as if binding something unholy. He fought not like a soldier, but like a man who has finally realized that dignity is no shield. The priest stood outside. He was not allowed to speak to Edward, only to witness. He was told to bless the act, to pray after not during, so he prayed to no one. He whispered the words not to God, but to history. The executioner didn't dress in black. He wore no mask. His face was blank. This was not a spectacle. It was an operation. He did not shout. He did not announce the sentence. He simply walked to the brazier and lifted the iron. It pulsed with heat, glowing with a life of its own. A small iron rod, forged not to pierce, but to enter and remain. They held Edward down, cloth between his teeth, ropes around his arms. They spread his legs as he kicked, as he whimpered, as he choked on his own tongue. The iron was inserted not with speed, but with care. It went in slowly, deliberately, pressed into the most sacred wound a man can bear. The skin cracked, the organs boiled. The stench hit first a reek of meat, of burnt linen, of something deeper than death. Not even the guards could mask their nausea. One turned his face. The priest stopped praying. The iron hissed inside him like a dying animal. But Edward did not die immediately. He convulsed, arched, bit his own lip until it bled. The cloth fell from his mouth. What came out was not a scream. It was a sound lower than any scream. A breath turned inside out, a moan that echoed like thunder buried beneath the earth. The guards backed away. The executioner stood, still holding the iron, now dark again, coated with black. He did not clean it. He did not look at it. He placed it back into the coals, where it would glow again, as if ready for another. Edward twitched, his hands curled like claws. His mouth opened and closed, gasping, but nothing came. And then, finally, his body stilled, not limp rigid, seized in one final pose of agony. They watched, not to honor him, but to confirm the stillness. Only then did they allow the priest to enter. The blessing was brief. There was no holy water, no confession, no anointing of oil. Only one word was whispered: forgive. But it was unclear if it was for Edward or for the men who had done it. The body was wrapped in linen that would never be washed. No embalming, no rite, just a bundle carried down stone stairs before dawn. The sun had not yet risen. The castle smelled of ash. No bells were rung, no banners lowered, only silence, which returned too quickly. As if afraid to linger, they burned the bed. They poured lime into the corners of the room. They scoured the floor with vinegar. But some things do not leave. The iron was not discarded. It was kept, locked, passed between hands in the dark, never spoken of aloud. It became a relic of control, not a weapon, but a warning. Kings who forget the rituals end like this, and those who remember stay silent outside the castle. The people were told he died peacefully, in his sleep, a sickness of the stomach, perhaps, or a chill in the lungs. No one asked to see the body. Those who did were denied. His son signed the papers the same day. He wore the crown with lips sealed. Even Isabella, once so furious, said nothing. Her hands were clean, officially, but the smell never left her silks. There were rumors, of course, that a servant overheard the screams, that a physician tried to speak but was drowned in the Thames, that the priest who had witnessed it lost his tongue to a sudden illness. But England, like the castle, prefers its ghosts to remain unseen. So the stories drifted, like smoke, like memory, like the breath of a man dying under cloth, unseen, unnamed. The room where he died was sealed, not out of respect, but because no one could sleep near it. Guards assigned to the tower fell ill. One slit his own wrist, another fled and was never found. They replaced them, again and again, until no one would take the post. Eventually, they locked it from the inside, bricked it shut, and said it had never existed. But every stone knows, and stones do not forget. Berkeley became quiet. Visitors avoided the west wing. The walls grew damp. Moss crept into the cracks. No one played music there again. Even the rats left. Some claimed Edward's ghost walked barefoot through the courtyard, not screaming, just walking, as if trying to find a bed he could die in without fire. His funeral was swift. No public display, just a closed casket and a eulogy read without conviction. No one mentioned the manner of death. No one dared. The priest who spoke did not use Edward's name until the final sentence. May God receive the soul of our brother. Not king, not son, just brother. A label that fit no one in the room. The brazier was never moved. It cooled in time. Its heat passed into the floor, into the bones of the building. They buried Edward without fanfare, without a monument. His tombstone was modest. No carving of sword or crown. Just a date, just a lie. But even lies sweat when pressed too long against the skin. And those who knew, who watched, who whispered, none of them escaped clean. One by one, they faded into illness, into disgrace, into the silence of their own rooms, as if the fire that entered Edward never stopped burning, as if it jumped from soul to soul, asking the same question, what did you see? No one ever answered. And that is how they kept control, not by writing history, but by mutilating it. And mutilation, when done right, does not scream. It lingers. The room was sealed, but the stench remained. It clung to the mortar between the stones. It lived in the fibers of the castle tapestries, though they had been washed, replaced, and finally removed altogether. In time, the guards refused to sleep in that wing. Horses avoided its path. At first, the whispers seemed like ordinary rumor servants trading fear as currency, but as years passed and the silence held, the aftershock of Edward's death began to ripple in ways no one could control. It began not with rebellion, but with rot. The very foundations of the myth that replaced him started to twist. The son who inherited the throne wore it like a yoke. Edward III would never speak his father's name in court. Not in passing, not in memory. When he signed laws, he did so in his own name, never the son of Edward II. Not even once. That omission was louder than any elegy. It was as if the previous king had never been, not erased from the records, but burned out of the bloodline. But blood doesn't forget. Neither does the church, no matter how deeply it buries the bodies. At first, the clerics said nothing. They avoided Berkeley in their sermons. They did not write of the death, not in diaries, not in marginalia, even in confession. When penitent monks whispered rumors, the abbots turned their faces to the wall. The silence was practiced, rehearsed. But silence is a kind of pressure, and pressure seeks release. One friar wrote of a great wrong that darkens the West, and then never wrote again. A bishop in Hereford lost his mind. He was found one morning kneeling before a brazier, his tongue charred, his eyes burned open, his last words scrawled in soot. He would not stop screaming. The legend began to return, not in chronicles, but in dreams. People claimed to hear footsteps in empty halls, a low moan beneath the bells. A child was born mute near the castle and died after muttering one word: fire. Still, the church said nothing. Still, the king said nothing. But something had shifted. The death they had tried to make invisible had begun to reflect itself in every mirror, in every quiet corner of every monastery where guilt hung like incense. And then came the miracle they could not ignore. 100 years after Edward's death, during a violent summer storm, lightning struck the west tower of Berkeley Castle. It did not burn. It shattered stone. The room was cracked open, the sealed chamber exposed for the first time in a century. What they found was not a ghost, but an absence so thick it chilled the air. The bed had rotted to splinters. The walls were blackened in the shape of hands. And in the center, untouched by water or time, lay a twisted iron rod, still faintly stained. It had no rust, no corrosion, only heat, dormant but not gone. It was taken to the local abbey for disposal, but none dared touch it with bare hands. The monk assigned to carry it died within the week. Fever, vomiting, night terrors. They buried the rod with him, beneath a tree that never grew again. Then, finally, came the reckoning not with the truth, but with its echo. In a quiet ceremony at Avignon, a papal scribe penned a document of canonization, not for Edward, but for the man he once raised to kingship, St. Thomas of Lancaster. It was an inversion, a quiet spit into the mouth of history. They would not sanctify Edward. They would only sanctify those who opposed him. Still, Edward's name stirred again, this time as a question, a shadow beneath the halo of saints. Why had he died? Why so secretly? Why so cruelly? And why? Even now, could no one say the English crown deflected? They pointed to old rebellions, to the Queen's righteousness, to the political necessity of deposition. But that was never the question. It was never about why he was removed. It was about how he died, and more importantly, why no one could speak of it without their voice cracking. It became a sickness among scholars, this inability to recount Edward's final moments without shaking, without resorting to metaphor, to myth. Even the most rational historians began to falter when they reached the year 1327. One wrote, "This year a king passed, though the manner is unclear, and the soul uncertain." Another, "What is not written may be written in blood elsewhere." Then came the revisionism, a strange thing in England, where monarchs are not often mourned once removed. But Edward's image began to soften. A few brave poets wrote of his kindness, of his joy in art, of the love he gave and the cruelty he received. A ballad emerged, anonymous, about a man who built canals and was buried in fire. The chorus was always the same. No one heard his scream, but the water remembers. It was banned, of course, but the ban made it grow. Eventually, a strange development occurred. A relic, unearthed in a distant churchyard near Gloucester, was claimed to be Edward's heart. It was encased in lead, etched with a forgotten prayer. Pilgrims began to visit. They left no flowers, only stones, only silence. It became a shrine not to holiness, but to injustice. And the church, cornered by centuries of omission, decided at last to act. They did not apologize. They do not do that. Instead, they canonized Edward quietly, as a political move, as a gesture of closure. But it was too late. The faithful did not see a saint. They saw a body burned alive by politics and pride. And so the aftershock rippled further, into art, into literature, into the collective mind of a nation too proud to weep. He appeared in paintings, no longer as a monarch, but as a boy, as a dreamer, always in the background, always alone. His figure haunted arches, loomed near braziers, hovered in the corners of cathedrals where light would not reach. One playwright wrote a tragedy about a king without a voice, and audiences sobbed without knowing why. But perhaps the most damning proof of the aftershock was this: no other English monarch would ever die like Edward. Others would fall beheaded, deposed, poisoned, but never again would they be silenced so completely, so ritualistically. Never again would fire be used to erase a lineage. The horror of Edward's death had become a blueprint for everything not to do. And in that twisted way, he had triumphed, not in life, not in memory, but in the way his mutilation changed the rules. Berkeley Castle remains, a historical site now, tidy, sanitized. Tour guides speak of architecture, of sieges, of the romance of medieval life. But they skip one room. They say it's under restoration. Structural issues, unstable flooring. Guests nod. They do not ask, but some look longer. Some feel the cold rise from the flagstones. Some swear they hear something beneath the wind. And always, behind glass, hidden in shadows, is a display case that holds nothing. It is labeled Instrument Unknown. The plaque reads, "Artifact recovered during renovations," possibly ceremonial, but there is no reflection in the glass. No explanation, just an emptiness that feels too heavy. The truth does not sleep. It circles, and though it is never declared, it is known. They called his death mercy, but even mercy burns. They said the ashes were scattered, that the fire consumed everything, but fires do not forget what they touch, and neither does the ground. In Rouen, in the corridors of cold stone where no monarch ever walked again, there is a breath that never leaves. Visitors feel it in their chests, an ache, a tightness, like being watched from beneath the earth. No plaque bears his name. No crown marks his tomb. Only silence, a silence that spreads like ink in water, deeper than death, older than forgiveness. Edward did not die a king, he died a warning. And still, England looks away. Still, it denies what it built. They called it justice. They called it necessary. But no one prays in the room where he ended. No one sings. What haunts is not the act, but the absence. A throne with no air, a room with no echoes, a death with no voice. They buried a man, but they raised a ghost. And if you stand near Berkeley at night, when the wind has no direction and even the stars refuse to speak, you will hear no scream, only the sound of breath held far too long, waiting to be named.